All right. Hello, everybody, and welcome to Can They Do That, a weekly Facebook Live series from the Scott Law team, where each week we answer one pressing question in employment law. This week's question: can they deny me overtime just because I am salaried? And the short answer to that question is no. Salaried does not automatically equal no overtime. It's a common misconception that overtime is determined based on whether you are paid hourly or salaried. And the short answer is no, that does not matter. Just because you're salaried does not automatically mean no overtime for you. Under the Fair Labor Standards Act, or the FLSA, which is the federal law that governs overtime, among other things, overtime must be given to all covered employees who work over 40 hours in a work week unless they are exempt. And the key terms there are covered and exempt, which we'll get to in a second, but I want to start from the idea here that under the FLSA, we start from the assumption that you are going to get overtime, regardless of whether you are salaried or hourly. Overtime must go to all covered employees unless you are exempt. So what does it mean to be covered under the FLSA? Well, covered is just a fancy word for saying that the FLSA applies to you. And what that means is that either the company you work for has at least $500,000 in gross revenue, or you individually as an employee somehow engage in interstate commerce, which can be something as simple as sending mail across state lines, using the phone to call people in other states, shipping or receiving goods, or using products from other states, or crossing state lines for work yourself. And if either of those apply to you, either your employer is covered or you personally are covered, then the FLSA applies to you. And if the FLSA applies to you, that means that your employer must give you overtime for all hours worked over 40 in a work week. Unless, of course, you're exempt. Exempt meaning that the FLSA does not apply to you. And an employee is exempt, meaning that your employer does not have to pay you overtime if both of the following are true. One, you are paid a salary, and you have certain job responsibilities. And the part that I really want to emphasize there is that being paid salary alone does not make you exempt. That's the whole point of the question here today, is can my employer deny me overtime if I'm paid a salary? If that's the only reason, no, they cannot. But there are going to be certain job responsibilities that we'll get to in a second that could make it so you are not eligible for overtime. But first, what does it even mean to be salaried? Salaried essentially means you're paid the same each pay period regardless of the amount of hours that you worked. Now on screen here you can see the actual guidance from the Department of Labor on what it means to be paid on a salary basis. And essentially that means you're receiving a predetermined amount each pay period on a weekly or less frequent basis. But the amount you receive cannot be reduced because of variations in the quality or quantity of your work. Essentially, if your pay changes week to week, then you are an hourly employee, and you should be getting paid overtime. Even if your employer or your pay stub or your paycheck says you are paid on a salary basis, if your pay is changing week to week, with a few exceptions, you are technically not a salaried employee, and you should be getting paid overtime, full stop, for any hours over 40. However, if your pay is not fluctuating week to week, and you are truly a salaried employee, that doesn't stop the question there, because even if you are a truly salaried employee, meaning, again, you get paid the same amount each week, you should still get overtime unless your job responsibilities are such that you become an exempt employee. And so we're going to talk through now some of the most common exemptions that we'll see under the Fair Labor Standards Act. And those are going to be the executive, the administrative, and the professional exemptions. Now, you should note that there are other exemptions under the Fair Labor Standards Act, and there's even some exceptions to those exemptions, such as for people who are blue-collar workers or law enforcement or first responders. But generally speaking, the most common exemptions are going to be the three that we're discussing here today. The first exemption is going to be the executive exemption. And again, I have on screen here the actual guidance from the Department of Labor that goes through what it means to match the executive exemption. Excuse me. Essentially, this is going to be the exemption where most individuals who are supervisors, managers, or decision makers lose their right to overtime. Now, one thing to note in there that you'll see is that the salary basis under the guidance is currently $684 per week, which comes out to about $36,000 per year. So if you're paid a salary below that, then the exemptions would not apply either. Essentially, a better way to describe the executive exemption is that if you have a role in things such as hiring, setting pay, disciplining other employees, you're not eligible for overtime. The same goes if you have any part in the scheduling or purchasing of supplies or handling any work-related decisions. Now, one thing that's important to note about this exemption in particular is that your job title is irrelevant. So just because your company calls you a supervisor or a manager, for example, if you're the, assistant manager over compliance, but if you don't actually manage anybody or you don't supervise anybody, then the exemption may not apply to you. What matters is what you actually do. It matters what your actual job responsibilities are, not what your job title is. The next exemption we're going to talk through is the administrative exemption. And again, the regulations or the guidance from the Department of Labor are there on screen, but essentially this is going to be the exemption where most office workers lose their rights to earn overtime. The examples we have there on screen are essentially if you're doing any work related to the management or general business operations, so things like financial decisions, taxes, accounting, budgets, things involving supply or purchase decisions for the company, items such as advertising, marketing, personnel management, or any sort of legal or other kind of compliance work. The idea here is, as you see there, when it says exercising discretion or judgment on significant matters. And there's a lot of factors that go in to whether that applies to you, and it really does depend on a job-by-job basis whether this is going to be a exemption that applies. But generally speaking, the more authority you have to make a decision that could impact the company's bottom line, the more likely this exemption is to apply to you. Of course, the inverse is true as well. If you have authority to make decisions, but those decisions don't impact the company's bottom line, or you don't have a whole lot of authority on your own to make those decisions, then this exemption is less likely to apply to you. And then the final exemptions we're going to go through today are the professional exemptions. And there's two of these that you can see on screen there. There's a learned professional exemption, and there's the creative professional exemption. But essentially, this is where most individuals whose job requires some sort of academic degree or other sort of higher learning, this is where you are going to lose your rights to overtime. So, examples of, under the learned professional exemption, some examples of fields of science or learning that are listed there on the guidance are going to be fields such as law, medicine, theology, accounting, actuarial computation, engineering, architecture, teaching, science-related professions such as pharmacy, and other occupations that have, as the guidance will say, some sort of recognized professional status, which can be distinguished from a mechanical profession or some sort of skilled trade. Some common professions that this can cause questions for that do qualify under this exemption, and by qualify I mean that you are an exempt employee and so therefore are not eligible for overtime, are going to be positions such as nursing, dental hygienist, a PA, a physician's assistant, accountants, some sort of trained chef. So it has to be more than just doing kind of here's a recipe and you're doing the day-to-day stuff, but an actual executive or sous chef, if you will, and athletic trainers. And then the creative fields, when it says work requiring invention, imagination, originality, or talent, these are going to be the fields that include those individuals who do things involving things such as music or writing, acting, or graphic arts are the examples that we have here on screen. And if you fall under those examples, then you are going to be exempt, meaning that because you are salaried, you are not going to be eligible for overtime. Now, the other complication when it comes to being a salaried employee is how is your overtime calculated. So let's say we go through everything you just went through there, and you are a salaried employee, but your job responsibilities are such to where you don't qualify for any of those exemptions. How do we calculate the value of your overtime? Now, traditionally, for a hourly or non-salaried employee, overtime is going to be at a time and a half rate. So the example we have here is, let's say you do a job where you're paid $10 an hour. For any hour you work over 40 hours in a work week, you should get paid $15 an hour, so time and a half. Salaried employees, it's a little different. The calculation here is something called halftime. Now, there's a note here that you should note that halftime is only appropriate if you as the employee and your employer have an understanding that the salary you're paid is meant to cover all of your hours worked, excluding any sort of premium for overtime. And what that means is that if you and your employer both have the understanding that no matter how many hours I work in a week, whether it's 35 or 45 or 30 or 50, whatever it is, I'm going to get paid the same, then halftime could be the appropriate rate there. And the reason for that is essentially that the thought is that, well, you already paid your salary for all those hours over 40, so you shouldn't be getting a premium on top of that outside of that extra halftime from the time and a half. And you can see the formula here on screen of how to calculate a halftime. It looks more complicated than it is. And so instead of going through that, we have an example here to show you what halftime is. So the example we have here on screen is take a salaried employee who's paid $1,000 a week. So no matter how many hours per week they work, they get $1,000. If they work 50 hours in a week, then for that week, their regular rate is $20 an hour. So that would be the $1,000 divided by the 50 hours they worked that week. Now you should note the regular rate is going to change depending on how many hours they worked in that week. So when you're calculating your overtime, you have to go week by week and find out what is the regular rate for each week. So for this employee here, who they worked 50 hours in a week, and their regular rate is $20 an hour, then we know their halftime rate is going to be $10 an hour, because that's going to be half of their regular rate. And so for those 10 hours of overtime they worked that week, because they worked 50 hours, so 50 minus 40, they worked 10 hours overtime, they should have been paid an additional $10 per hour for those 10 hours, or in this example here, $100. So let's say they were paid their salary of $1,000 for that week. They should have been paid $1,100 that week because they should have gotten the additional overtime premium for those extra $10 an hour. And that's all we have today as far as whether you can be denied overtime if you are paid salary. To kind of sum things up, remember the short answer is no, you can't be unless you are an exempt employee. But we should always be starting from the presumption that if the FLSA applies to you, the presumption is that you should be paid overtime unless you are exempt. And all those exemptions are going to require salaried, and that's what the confusion comes in there. Now, if anybody has any questions after viewing this video today or after being part of our live session today, you can contact us on screen there. It's scottlawteam.com or intake@scottlawteam. We're always happy to go through anybody's job and discuss whether you should or shouldn't be being paid overtime as a salaried employee.